I still remember the quiet sound of the delivery truck pulling away that morning. It had been exactly 3 weeks since my divorce became official, and every day still felt unfamiliar. The house was the same, but nothing inside it felt like home anymore. The pictures had been taken down, the extra coffee mug stayed in the cabinet, the silence seemed louder than any argument we had ever shared. I had settled into a routine that was more about surviving than living. I woke up before sunrise, made breakfast for one, drove to work, kept my head down, and returned home hoping the evening would pass quickly without giving me too much time to think. When I walked onto my front porch that Saturday morning, I noticed a plain brown box sitting beside the welcome mat. There was no shipping label, no company logo, and no note attached to the outside. For a moment I looked around the neighborhood, wondering if someone had left it by mistake. My closest neighbors were friendly enough, but nobody usually stopped by without calling first. I picked up the box and carried it inside. It was surprisingly light. I placed it on the kitchen table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a small wooden frame holding a simple photograph. It was a picture of me standing beside my father almost 20 years earlier. We were building the old treehouse behind my childhood home. Both of us were smiling in a way I had almost forgotten. Beneath the frame rested a folded envelope. The handwriting on the front stopped me in my tracks. It belonged to my boss, Daniel. I had worked for Daniel for nearly 15 years. He was respected by everyone in the office, fair, calm, reliable. We talked about projects, deadlines, and customers, but never much about our personal lives. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was only one short sentence. Sometimes losing one life is the only way to find the one you were meant to live. There was no signature. No explanation. Just those words. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the picture, wondering why Daniel had chosen that moment to send something so personal. The answer was not nearly as simple as I imagined. The following Monday, I arrived at work expecting another ordinary day. I planned to thank Daniel privately for the thoughtful gift, but before I had the chance, he called me into his office. He smiled politely and motioned toward the chair across from his desk. I sat down, holding my coffee, unsure where the conversation was heading. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You probably have questions about the package." I nodded. "I do." He folded his hands and looked out the window. "Your father helped someone in my family many years ago." I frowned. That surprised me because my father had lived a quiet life as a carpenter in a small town. He rarely talked about anything beyond family work and church. Daniel continued. "He never told you about it, did he?" I slowly shook my head. "No." He smiled gently. "That sounds exactly like him." Before I could ask another question, his phone rang. He apologized, answered briefly, then stood up. "We will talk later," he said. "There is more you deserve to know." As I left his office, my curiosity followed me through the rest of the day. Every spreadsheet, every meeting, every phone call faded into the background. For the first time since my divorce, my thoughts were not trapped in the past. They were reaching towards something I had never known. That evening I drove to my mother's house, carrying the photograph with me. She opened the door wearing her familiar warm smile, though I could still see concern hiding behind her eyes. She had worried about me ever since the divorce, but never pushed too hard. We sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten countless family dinners growing up. I placed the photograph in front of her. "Do you remember this day?" She smiled immediately. "Of course I do. Your father spent weeks planning that treehouse. He wanted you to believe anything worth building deserved patience." I slid Daniel's note across the table. Her smile slowly faded. She read the sentence twice before looking at me. "Where did you get this?" I explained everything. The package. The note. The conversation in Daniel's office. She became unusually quiet. Then she stood and walked toward an old cabinet in the dining room. From the bottom drawer she removed a faded blue folder. I had never seen it before. She placed it carefully on the table but kept one hand resting on top of it. "There are some things your father wanted to tell you," she said softly. "He kept waiting for the right time." I looked at the folder, then back at her. "What is it?" She took a slow breath. A part of his life he believed would never matter again. But maybe now it finally does. My heart began beating faster. For the first time in weeks I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt hope mixed with questions that had no easy answers. As my mother slowly opened the folder, I realized my father's story had never truly ended. It had simply been waiting for me to find it. My mother carefully lifted the first page from the faded blue folder and placed it in front of me. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping with my father's name mentioned near the bottom. I leaned closer, trying to understand why Daniel had said my father once changed someone else's life. The article described a terrible storm that had hit a neighboring county more than 30 years earlier. Several homes had been damaged and dozens of families had been left stranded. One paragraph explained how a local carpenter had organized volunteers and worked for weeks rebuilding homes without asking for a single dollar. That carpenter was my father. I looked up at my mother. Why did he never tell me any of this? She smiled sadly. Because he never believed kindness was something you talked about. He believed you simply did it and moved on. She handed me another document. This one was a handwritten letter. The ink had faded, but I could still read every word. It was written by a woman thanking my father for helping her family after the storm. She explained that without his help they would have lost everything. Their young son had watched my father work every day, carrying lumber, fixing roofs, and encouraging exhausted neighbors when they felt ready to give up. At the bottom of the page the woman had signed her name. Emily Brooks. The name meant nothing to me. Until my mother quietly spoke. Daniel is her son. I stared at her in disbelief. You mean my boss? She nodded. Your father never wanted recognition. He told Daniel's mother that someday if Daniel became successful he should help someone else instead of trying to repay him. I leaned back in my chair, unable to find the right words. For years I had worked only a few offices away from someone whose life had been touched by my father, and I had never known. It suddenly made Daniel's gift feel much bigger than a simple photograph. My mother reached deeper into the folder. There is something else. She pulled out a small notebook with a worn leather cover. Your father wrote in this during the last year of his life. He wanted you to have it someday. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first page. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Strong, steady, and simple. The first sentence stopped me cold. If you are reading this, then life has probably disappointed you in ways I hoped it never would. It felt as though he were sitting across from me, speaking directly to me. I kept reading. There will come a season when you believe everything you built has fallen apart. Do not mistake an ending for the end of your story. Some of the strongest people I have ever known first had to lose the life they planned before they discovered the life they needed. I closed the notebook for a moment, trying to steady myself. Those words landed differently after my divorce. For weeks I had believed my marriage defined my future. Now I wondered if my father had somehow understood years ago what I was only beginning to learn. Still, there was one question I could not shake. Why had Daniel waited until now to tell me any of this? The next morning I arrived at work earlier than usual. Daniel's office door was already open. He looked up from his desk and smiled. I figured you might come by. I carried the notebook with me and placed it gently on his desk. My mother showed me everything. He looked at the cover and nodded. Your father gave that notebook to my mother before he passed away. He told her to return it only when you needed it most. I frowned. Why not give it to me years ago? Because your father believed advice means very little until life prepares you to hear it. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally I asked the question that had stayed with me all night. Why did you leave the photograph on my porch instead of just talking to me? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Because 3 weeks ago I recognized the same look in your eyes that my mother once had after the storm. She had lost hope before your father reminded her that tomorrow still existed. He paused before continuing. I couldn't fix your marriage, I couldn't erase your pain, but I could remind you whose son you are. His words stayed with me long after I returned to my desk. That afternoon work ended earlier than expected. Instead of driving straight home, I found myself taking the old highway toward the town where I grew up. I had not visited my childhood property in years. The house had been sold after my parents moved away. As I pulled into the familiar road, everything looked smaller than I remembered. The giant oak tree still stood in the backyard. And somehow the old treehouse was still there. Weathered and leaning slightly but standing. I climbed the wooden steps carefully, hearing them creak beneath my feet. Inside I found dust scattered across the floor and sunlight shining through tiny cracks in the walls. Someone had left an old wooden toolbox in the corner. Curious, I opened it. Most of the tools were rusty, but beneath them rested another envelope. There was only my first name written across the front. No date. No explanation. Just my name in my father's handwriting. For several moments I simply stared at it. I could feel my heartbeat echoing inside the tiny treehouse. How had this letter remained hidden for so many years? Why had no one ever mentioned it? I slowly slipped my finger beneath the edge of the envelope, knowing that whatever waited inside might change the way I remembered my father forever. And as I unfolded the first page, I realized this was not a letter about his past. It was written for my future. I unfolded the letter with careful hands, almost afraid that the moment would disappear if I moved too quickly. The paper had yellowed with time, but my father's handwriting remained clear and steady. My son, if you have found this letter, then life has probably taken a path neither of us expected. I cannot be there to sit beside you, but I hope these words feel close enough. Never measure your worth by who stays or who leaves. Measure it by the kind of person you choose to become after both. I read those lines several times. For weeks after my divorce, I had quietly blamed myself for everything. I replayed every conversation, every disagreement, every missed opportunity, wondering what I could have changed. Yet my father seemed to understand something I had been unwilling to accept. Sometimes people grow apart without either person becoming the villain. The letter continued. The strongest homes are not always the ones with the nicest walls. They are the ones built on kindness, patience, and forgiveness. Build your next life that way, even if you must build it alone at first. I closed my eyes for a moment. The treehouse around me suddenly felt less like an old childhood memory and more like the place where my future was quietly beginning. Before leaving, I looked around one last time and noticed something carved into one of the wooden beams. Together we build. I smiled. That had always been my father's way. Not just with wood but with people. The following week life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but something inside me had changed. I no longer rushed home trying to escape the silence. Instead, I began filling the evenings with things I had neglected for years. I started volunteering on Saturday mornings with a local community group that repaired homes for elderly residents who could no longer do the work themselves. The first time I picked up a hammer, I immediately thought of my father. The smell of fresh lumber, the sound of nails meeting wood, and the simple satisfaction of helping someone reminded me of afternoons we had spent together without realizing they would become some of my most valuable memories. One afternoon, an elderly woman watched our team replace the broken steps leading to her front porch. When we finished, she quietly thanked each of us with tears in her eyes. She reached for my hand and said, "You probably think you fixed my steps today. What you really gave me was the confidence to leave my house again." Her words stayed with me long after we packed our tools. That evening, Daniel invited me to dinner at his home. It was the first time we had spent time together outside the office. His wife welcomed me warmly and their grown children joined us around the table. Laughter filled the room in a way I had not experienced for a long time. After dinner, Daniel handed me a small photo album. Inside were dozens of pictures from the rebuilding effort after the storm all those years ago. There was my father carrying lumber, helping children paint fences, sharing sandwiches with volunteers during lunch, and smiling in nearly every photograph. Daniel looked at me. "My mother kept these all these years. She always said your father taught her that hope is something ordinary people give each other every day." I carefully turned another page. Then another. Each photograph revealed a man I thought I knew but was only now beginning to understand. On the final page was a picture of a young Daniel standing beside my father. Across the bottom, my father had written, "Help someone when you can, because one act of kindness always reaches farther than you will ever see." I looked up, unable to speak. Daniel smiled. "Your father changed my family. Without him, I doubt I would have become the person I am today. Now maybe it is your turn to keep that kindness moving forward." Those words settled deep inside me. Months passed. The pain of the divorce no longer controlled every morning. I still missed the life I once imagined, but I had stopped living inside memories that could never return. Instead, I focused on the people standing in front of me. Friends I had ignored during difficult years. Neighbors I barely knew. Coworkers carrying burdens they never talked about. I listened more carefully. I judged less quickly. And whenever possible, I tried to leave people a little better than I found them. One crisp autumn afternoon, I drove back to the old treehouse carrying a small wooden frame. Inside it was the same photograph Daniel had left on my porch. I placed it carefully on one of the shelves along with a copy of my father's letter. Then I added a simple handwritten note beneath it. If this place ever reminds someone that tomorrow is worth believing in, then it has served its purpose. As I climbed down the ladder, I looked back one final time. The treehouse stood quietly beneath the old oak tree just as it had decades earlier. Weathered but still standing. Much like the lessons my father left behind. Driving home, I realized something that had taken me far too long to understand. The package on my porch had never been about a photograph. It had never been about an old story. It had been an invitation. An invitation to stop mourning the life I had lost and begin building the one waiting in front of me. 3 weeks after my divorce, I believed everything important had ended. Instead, it was the day a new chapter quietly began. If my father left me one lasting gift, it was this. No matter how broken life feels, kindness has a way of rebuilding what despair cannot. And sometimes the smallest gift left on an ordinary porch becomes the beginning of an extraordinary future. The end.